Okay, let's recall the topic of our discussion, and that's why the post World War II era, known as the Cold War, served as an opportune moment for the emergence of the civil rights movement, a perfect time for it to gain traction. And we discuss why these various factors, returning veterans, the Double V campaign, fascism, and the stigma of racism, emergence of the black middle class that served as the face of the civil rights movement. Of course, television, which is going to broadcast to the masses, those areas all over the country and the world, to be frank, how ugly Jim Crow was in its insistence to keep this races separate, the extent to which they were willing to perpetrate violence against peaceful um, church going folk who were decently presented, dressed in their Sunday's best, let's recall. And this gave uh, the whole Jim Crow system in the South ugly face to it, right? So, certainly worked in convincing Americans that the Jim Crow system was indeed, if you will, evil. But we also have to talk about the Cold War propaganda that was happening during this time, and this is between the United States and the USSR, the Soviet Union at that time. So, what was this about? Okay, in order to discuss this, we need to roll back a little bit and discuss the world and geopolitics as it was before World War II and World War One, and let's say at the turn of the 20th century, in other words, 1900. Back then, over 90% of the globe was controlled in some shape or form by some European empire, whether outright colonization or at the very least it was controlled indirectly by some European country. Now, with the two world wars that happened so close to each other, World War One and World War Two, which were, for the most part, imperial wars between these various European empires, that system of European imperialism collapsed, especially after World War II. That was the death knell, if you will, of the European imperial system. Honestly, that had been around since 1492. So, what does this lead to? It leads to these European empires dissolving. And of course, that means they're unable to hold on to their colonies across the globe. That's because their countries are devastated by World War II, and not to mention World War One. So the net effect here is that the colonies began to gain independence. And thus you have this movement of global decolonization happen right after World War II. Okay, so what's going to replace that European imperial system that was, let me remind you, global in its scope? Well, it's replaced by new empires, and the empires that succeed the European imperial system, that's the United States, the Empire of the United States, and the USSR, and eventually the People's Republic of China. Those were the biggest powers um, with the conclusion of World War II. And of course, this is going to be the case through the successive decades until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you have something that you're probably familiar with, the division of the world into three parts. There's the first world, which is the United States and our allies. Then there's the second world, and that's the USSR and their various satellite countries and allies. And then there's the third world, as noted here. There's the newly decolonized nations. Okay, because as I just mentioned, you had this massive movement of global decolonization and independence after World War II. So there was this huge struggle between the first world, the United States and our allies, and the second world, USSR and its allies, in order to attract the newly independent, decolonized nations that constitute the third world. Now, one thing about the third world countries is, racially speaking, they're comprised of persons of color, brown skin, black skin, so to speak. All right, so here are both sides, the first world and the second world, trying to gain the allegiance of the third world, newly decolonized nation. So again, this is a war of propaganda between the first world and the second world in the attempt to arrange the global order to its respective favor. And the propaganda that emanated from the first world was indeed based upon freedom. They sent the message that, hey, the second world, Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, they are not democratic. They are the opposite of democracy, and they don't respect freedom for individuals, and therefore you should align with the first world. Okay, so how did the Soviet Union respond to that accusation? Well, they said this, that the United States claims to be the free world, but look how it treats its persons of color within its country. Look how it treats African Americans and other racial minorities. They are second-class citizens. They don't enjoy the rights that whites do. And therefore, all you countries that are decolonizing, you are comprised of darker-skinned people. Do you believe that the United States believes in freedom and democracy for darker-skinned people? Okay, so this was the propaganda that emanated from the USSR, and it was very effective. Why? Because the United States had no answer to it. It was, in fact, accurate. It was the truth. Persons of color did not enjoy the same rights as, the majority race being white. No, they had secondary status or held secondary status in their own country. And as you can imagine, the United States felt that it had to do something in view of this propaganda war between the U.S. and the USSR. So this is almost a more pragmatic maneuver by the U.S. government, that is, to support civil rights, to support the end of racial segregation in the South, and therefore to demonstrate before the world that they are the champions of freedom regardless of skin color. And therefore they could gain the allegiance of these newly decolonized nations across the world, who, again, let me remind you, are darker skinned people. Okay, so now we can begin to discuss the civil rights movement after World War II. And note here that historians have called this era of civil rights the Second Reconstruction. Of course, meaning that after the first Reconstruction failed, you had this brief period of rebuilding, and once it gained traction, especially after World War II, you could begin to engage in this civil rights movement, sort of a second phase to it, right? Hence, Second Reconstruction. And we'll talk about three dimensions of the civil rights movement. Of course, there's the political dimension, and that deals with the political rights that were taken away from African Americans. They were disenfranchised of the vote, and therefore the goal here is to reestablish the black vote in the southern states. And then there's also the social and the religious. The social involves everyday people, and especially white activists, many of them from the North, that would come down to the South and engage in civil rights protest in the fight to combat Jim Crow in the South. And then there's the religious dimension, which is very important. You're probably familiar with the fact that Martin Luther King was a preacher, a minister, and you have various other ministers who are crucial figures in this struggle. And again, it's the critical role of the black church and their leaders, and not to mention the influence of religious thought that's going to loom large here in this seminal era of social history in the United States, that is to say, the civil rights movement. So let us begin with the political dimension of the civil rights movement. And what they're involved in is how to frontally engage with de jure segregation, with Jim Crow segregation in the South, the whole system of racial separation. And you see some institutions that are crucial in this regard. The NAACP, which, as we discussed a few moments ago, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And what this institution will do will be to challenge the legal basis of Jim Crow. Let's remember that goes all the way back to Plessy versus Ferguson. And by this time, post-World War II, what the NAACP will do is attack Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, other institutions that are crucial during this time is what's known as historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. And probably the most preeminent among them was Howard University. And Howard University will develop a strong mandate for black justice. And it will indeed attract the best and brightest within the African American community. And of course, what they're going to be involved with here is this crusade to end Jim Crow in the country. And basically, this means from a legal basis, they have to find a way to defeat Plessy versus Ferguson, right? The separate but equal clause. How can you prove, however, that separation leads to not equality, but leads to inequality? How can you prove that separation leads to unequal conditions? All right, so here's where you see the lead attorney, Thurgood Marshall, who gained prominence at this time, a very leading figure in the legal battle. Again, we're talking about, the legal aspect or the political dimension here. And he has to figure out a way, him and his legal team has to figure out a way to discredit and to demonstrate that Jim Crow leads not to equality, but to inequality. Jim Crow segregation does not provide for equal opportunity. It does not lead to separate but equal. Okay, so again, how do you do this? Well, they came up with a doll test here by a psychologist whose name was Kenneth Clark, hence the name Kenneth Clark doll test. And here's what Kenneth Clark did. This psychologist separated two groups of kids according to race, one group being white kids, the other group being black kids. And he had both groups play with white dolls and black dolls. So after they played with the black dolls and the white dolls, he went on to ask each group of kids which doll do they prefer more, the white dolls or the black dolls. Okay, so he asked the white kids first, hey, which doll do you like better? Which one is your favorite? Well, they all said the white doll over the black doll. So he then moved on to the black kids and asked the same question. Which doll do you like more, the black doll or the white doll? And overwhelmingly, the black kids responded with the white doll. So what did this demonstrate? What did this prove according to Kenneth Clark, the psychologist? Well, it proved to him that the black kids who preferred the white dolls had at a very young age internalized this decorum and feeling of inferiority to the point where they prefer the white dolls over the black dolls. And indeed, the root cause of this was racial segregation. These are the pathological effects that are impressed upon a child at a very young age. And here's the Supreme Court's feeling about this in the statement: to separate black children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. So this was a very effective argument to challenge de jure segregation.